They tell you that dying is the hardest part. They're wrong. The hardest part is watching your own funeral from the back of the chapel and realizing that not a single person there is crying for the right reasons. I was 58 years old when I died. At least, that's what the obituary said. Patricia and Hutchinson, beloved mother, devoted wife, cherished friend. The words were beautiful. The lies were even better. My son Daniel stood at the podium, 26 years old and dressed in a suit I'd never seen before, reading from a crumpled piece of paper about how much he'd miss his mother's Sunday pot roasts and her laugh. But I knew that boy. I'd raised him. And I knew when he was performing. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you die for, you know exactly how I felt in that moment. You know that hollow, burning sensation that starts in your chest and spreads like poison through every vein. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because I promise you, this story is going to take you somewhere you never expected to go. And if you want more stories like this, stories that'll make your blood run cold and your heart race, check the description box below. I've got plenty more where this came from. The chapel was full. My husband Richard sat in the front row, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. 40 years of marriage, and I'd thought I knew every angle of that man's face. Turned out I didn't know him at all. My sister Janet was there too, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her other hand resting on Richard's arm. Comforting him. Supporting him. Playing her role perfectly. The casket was closed. They'd told everyone it had to be, that the accident had been too severe, that they wanted people to remember me as I was. The truth was simpler and far more calculated. There was a body in that casket, but it wasn't mine. It was a Jane Doe from the county morgue, a woman approximately my age and build who died alone and unclaimed. Richard had paid good money to make sure the dental records got mixed up, to make sure the coroner's report said what it needed to say. He'd thought of everything. Almost everything. I stood at the back of the chapel in a black dress I'd bought 3 towns over, my hair dyed auburn instead of its natural silver blonde, oversized sunglasses covering half my face. Nobody looked at me twice. Why would they? Just another mourner, another friend from some distant chapter of the deceased's life. I watched my son carry my casket down the aisle. I watched my husband follow behind it, his hand clutched in my sister's. I watched them lower me into the ground at Riverside Cemetery under a gray October sky, and I watched them shovel dirt onto a coffin that held a stranger while they buried my briefcase right alongside her. That briefcase. God, if they'd only known. It had been Richard's idea to bury it with me. Your most prized possession, he'd said at the funeral home, his voice thick with manufactured grief. She'd want it with her. The funeral director had nodded sympathetically. People bury strange things with their loved ones. Photographs, jewelry, favorite books. A briefcase wasn't the oddest request he'd ever honored. So into the ground it went, clutched in the dead woman's hands, filled with the evidence that would have destroyed them all. Richard thought he was being poetic. Sentimental, even. What he actually was stupid. See, that briefcase didn't just contain documents. It contained 15 years of carefully compiled proof. Bank statements showing the money Richard had been siphoning from our accounts. Photographs of him and Janet, my own sister, tangled up in bedsheets at the lake house I'd bought with my inheritance. Email printouts detailing how Daniel had been in on it too, helping his father forge my signature on loan documents, on property transfers, on a new will that left everything to Richard and cut me out entirely. They'd been planning this for years. Bleeding me dry while I smiled and cooked their dinners and believed I was living in a happy family. The night before my accident, I'd found it all. I'd come home early from my book club. Margaret had cancelled because of a migraine, and I'd walked into my own house to find the 3 of them sitting around my dining room table with a lawyer. My husband, my sister, my son, and a man in an expensive suit, discussing how much longer they'd need to wait before they could have me declared incompetent. Maybe early onset Alzheimer's, the lawyer had suggested. Easy to fake with the right medical testimony. Then they could take control of everything without the messy complications of divorce or suspicion. I'd stood in the hallway and listened to them plan my erasure. My legal death. And that's when I knew that actually dying might be my only way to survive. I didn't confront them that night. I went upstairs, packed a small bag, and I disappeared. I had friends they didn't know about, resources I'd quietly set aside over the years because some part of me had always known not to put all my faith in the people who claimed to love me. I called in favors. I made arrangements. And then I staged an accident on Highway 47, my car going off the bridge into the Clearwater River, the vehicle found submerged 3 days later with no body inside. The current was strong there. People went missing in that river all the time. But I didn't go missing. I went underground. And I watched. I watched them collect the insurance money. I watched them sell my house, my mother's antique furniture, every piece of jewelry I'd ever owned. I watched Daniel buy a new truck, watched Janet move into a condo downtown, watched Richard start dating again within 2 months. A woman from his office, blonde and young and nothing like me. They'd mourned for exactly as long as it took to cash the checks. And I waited. Because revenge isn't something you rush. Revenge is something you plan, something you build brick by brick until the foundation is so solid that when you finally pull the trigger, the whole structure comes crashing down in one beautiful, devastating collapse. 6 months after my funeral, Daniel got himself arrested. Securities fraud, of all things. The boy had taken some of that inheritance money and tried to flip it through a friend's investment scheme that turned out to be spectacularly illegal. The trial was set for January. My sister called it tragic. My husband called it a nightmare. I called it an opportunity. Because there was one thing I'd been before I became a wife and mother, one piece of my past I'd left behind when I'd married Richard and settled into suburban domesticity. I'd been an attorney. Not just any attorney, a criminal defense attorney, and a damn good one. I'd walked away from it when Daniel was born, told myself I wanted to be present for my child, that the courtroom drama wasn't worth missing bedtimes and school plays. But the bar card was still active. The skills were still sharp. And nobody in that courtroom was going to recognize Patricia and Hutchinson, the dead woman with silver blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses who'd baked cookies for the PTA. But they might recognize the auburn-haired woman in the tailored suit who walked through those courtroom doors carrying a briefcase that shouldn't exist. I spent 6 months preparing for this moment. 6 months studying every angle of Daniel's case, every weakness in the prosecution's argument, every legal loophole I could exploit. Not because I wanted to save him. God no. I wanted to walk into that courtroom and watch his face when he realized that the mother he'd helped bury was about to become his only shot at staying out of prison. I wanted him to feel the same helpless terror I'd felt when I'd stood in that hallway and heard my own family planning my destruction. The trial started on a Tuesday morning. January 14th. I remember because it was snowing, those fat wet flakes that melt the second they hit pavement, and I'd stood outside the courthouse for 10 minutes just watching them fall, gathering my courage, checking my reflection one last time in the glass doors. Then I walked inside. And everything changed. My son's face went pale when I stepped through the courtroom doors. Not just pale, gray, like someone had physically drained the blood from his body. He was sitting at the defense table next to a public defender, who looked about 12 years old and completely out of his depth. The prosecutor was mid-sentence, something about pattern of deception and abuse of trust, and then the door clicked shut behind me and his voice just stopped. The prosecutor looked up. Then he stopped mid-sentence and breathed, "No way. That's impossible." Every head turned toward me. Richard was in the gallery, 3rd row back, right side. I watched his jaw go slack, watched his hands grip the wooden bench in front of him like he might fall through the floor without something to hold on to. Janet was next to him, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide as saucers. For a second, just one perfect, crystalline second, the entire courtroom held its breath. I walked down the center aisle in my charcoal suit and 4-inch heels, my briefcase in my right hand, my credentials folder in my left. My hair was different. My face was different. I'd lost 20 pounds and the stress had carved new lines around my eyes. But the walk was the same. The way I held my shoulders was the same. And when I reached the defense table and set that briefcase down, the same worn leather briefcase with the brass initials PH embossed on the front, the same briefcase they'd lowered into the ground with my body 6 months ago, there wasn't a person in that room who didn't understand exactly what they were seeing. The judge was a woman in her mid-60s, Judge Catherine Brennan, someone I'd known professionally back in my practicing days. She stared at me like I was a ghost manifesting in her courtroom in broad daylight. Counselor, she said slowly, carefully, like she was testing whether I was real or hallucination. State your name for the record. I smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a warm smile. The smile of a woman who'd been dead for half a year and had come back with a purpose. Patricia and Hutchinson, I said clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of that silent courtroom. I'm here to represent the defendant, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to file a motion for immediate dismissal of counsel and enter my appearance as Daniel Hutchinson's attorney of record. The young public defender looked like Christmas had come early. Daniel looked like he was going to vomit all over the defense table. The prosecutor, his name was Gordon something, I'd researched him thoroughly, finally found his voice. Your Honor, this is insane. Patricia Hutchinson is dead. There's a death certificate on file with the county. There's a grave in Riverside Cemetery. This is some kind of fraud, some kind of... Mr. Gordon, Judge Brennan cut him off, her eyes still fixed on me. I've known Ms. Hutchinson for 20 years. I attended her funeral. She paused, and I could see her legal mind working, processing, recalibrating. I also know that a death certificate can be issued in error, particularly when a body hasn't been positively identified. Ms. Hutchinson, I assume you have documentation proving you're alive. I opened my credentials folder and passed my driver's license, my bar card, and a notarized affidavit across the bench. Judge Brennan studied them for what felt like an hour but was probably 90 seconds. Then she looked at Daniel, who was staring at me like I'd crawled out of his worst nightmare, and she looked at the prosecutor, and she made a decision. Motion to dismiss counsel is granted, she said. Ms. Hutchinson, welcome back from the dead. We'll take a 30-minute recess to sort out this irregularity. Mr. Gordon, I suggest you use that time to verify everything you just saw. The courtroom erupted. Not shouting, this wasn't that kind of crowd, but a low buzz of shock and confusion that spread through the gallery like electricity. Richard tried to stand up and immediately sat back down like his legs wouldn't work. Janet was crying, actual tears streaming down her face, and I couldn't tell if they were from fear or disbelief or rage. Daniel just sat there frozen, his eyes locked on the briefcase that wasn't supposed to exist. I leaned down close to my son, close enough that only he could hear me, and I whispered, "We need to talk. Conference room. Now." He followed me like a sleepwalker. The court officer directed us to a small attorney conference room off the main hallway, one of those windowless boxes with a metal table and 4 chairs that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. I waited until the door closed. Then I set the briefcase on the table between us, popped the latches, and opened it. Inside wasn't what Daniel expected. No legal documents related to his case. Instead, there were the bank statements, the photographs, the emails, the forged signatures, the recorded conversations I'd collected over the past 6 months. Conversations between Richard and Janet discussing how much longer they needed to keep up appearances, conversations between Richard and his lawyer planning how to distribute my estate, conversations between Daniel and his father about the investment scheme that had landed him in this courtroom. Everything. Every piece of their conspiracy laid out in organized manila folders with color-coded tabs. Daniel stared at the contents like he was staring into his own grave. "Mom," he whispered, and his voice cracked. "Mom, don't." I held up one hand. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't say you didn't mean it. Don't insult me with excuses. You faked your death." He said it like an accusation, like I was the villain in this scenario. "I survived," I corrected him. "There's a difference. You and your father and my sister tried to erase me while I was still breathing. I simply obliged you by making it official." I leaned forward. "Now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to defend you in this trial. I'm going to use every ounce of my skill and experience to keep you out of prison. And I'm going to win." He blinked. "Why?" "Because you're my son," I said simply. "And despite everything you've done, despite the fact that you stood at my funeral and lied through your teeth, I'm still your mother. That doesn't just go away." I paused, let that sink in. "But here's the price. When this trial is over, when you're a free man, you're going to testify. You're going to tell the truth about everything you and Richard and Janet did. You're going to provide evidence for the fraud investigation I'm filing against your father. You're going to help me reclaim every penny they stole, every asset they sold, every piece of my life they tried to bury. Daniel's hands were shaking. Dad will kill me. Your father, I said coldly, doesn't have that kind of power anymore. I do. So you have a choice. Help me, and walk away from this trial with your freedom and maybe a shred of redemption. Or refuse, and I'll withdraw as your counsel, and you can take your chances with that public defender who looks like he passed the bar last week. If you're still watching this, drop a comment and let me know what you'd do in my son's position. Would you turn on your father to save yourself? Would you finally tell the truth after years of lies? And if you're hooked on this story, if you need to know how this all plays out, check the description box below for more stories that'll keep you up at night. Daniel closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Okay, he whispered. Okay. I'll do it. I nodded, closed the briefcase, and stood up. Good. Now let's go win you a trial. The trial lasted 8 days, and I performed like I'd never left the courtroom. Every objection was perfectly timed. Every cross-examination was surgical. The prosecution had built their case on the assumption that Daniel was a calculating con artist who'd knowingly participated in a sophisticated fraud scheme. I dismantled that assumption piece by piece, showing instead a young man who'd been manipulated by more experienced criminals, who'd been used as a pawn in a game he barely understood. It wasn't entirely true, of course. Daniel had known exactly what he was doing. But the law isn't about truth, it's about reasonable doubt, about narrative, about which story the jury believes. And I told a hell of a story. I called character witnesses. I called financial experts who testified that the investment scheme's complexity would have been beyond a 26-year-old's understanding. I poked holes in the prosecution's timeline and created alternative explanations for every piece of evidence they presented. Gordon fought hard, I'll give him that, but he was outmatched and he knew it. By day 6, I could see it in his face. He was already preparing for the loss. But the real performance wasn't happening in the courtroom. It was happening every evening, when court recessed and I went back to the apartment I'd rented under my new identity, and I compiled my own case. The case against Richard and Janet and everyone else who'd thought they could steal my life. I'd hired a forensic accountant named David Reeves, a man I'd worked with on cases 15 years ago who didn't ask questions when I showed up alive and requested his services. He traced every dollar, every transfer, every fraudulent transaction. The picture he painted was devastating. Richard had been embezzling from me for over a decade, starting small, a few thousand here and there, and escalating when he'd started his affair with Janet. Together, they'd stolen nearly $2 million of my inheritance, my retirement accounts, the proceeds from my mother's estate. Daniel had been brought into the conspiracy 3 years ago, right after his 23rd birthday. Richard had convinced him that I was becoming unstable, that I was making bad financial decisions, that they needed to protect the family assets. The boy had believed it. Or maybe he'd just wanted to believe it because it made the theft easier to stomach. Either way, he'd forged my signatures, he'd lied to lawyers and bankers, and he'd looked me in the eye over Sunday dinners while helping his father rob me blind. The will they'd drafted would have split everything between Richard and Daniel after my death. Janet would have gotten a generous gift as my beloved sister, but the bulk of the estate would have stayed with the men. Traditional. Neat. Perfectly legal, assuming I'd actually signed it and been of sound mind when I did. But I hadn't signed it. And I had the handwriting analysis to prove it. On day 8 of Daniel's trial, the jury came back after 4 hours of deliberation. Not guilty on all counts. Daniel sagged in his chair like a puppet with cut strings. The public gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Brennan banged her gavel and reminded everyone that her courtroom was not a theater, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She'd always appreciated good legal work, even when the circumstances were bizarre. Richard wasn't in the courtroom that day. Neither was Janet. They'd stopped coming after day 3, once it became clear that my appearance wasn't some temporary hallucination, that I was real and I was devastating and I wasn't going away. I'd seen Richard's lawyer in the hallway during a recess, a slick corporate type who'd tried to approach me with some sort of settlement offer. I told him to go to hell in language unprofessional enough that Judge Brennan would have cited me for contempt if she'd heard it. After the verdict, Daniel and I walked out of that courthouse into the January cold. Snow was falling again, heavier this time, and the courthouse steps were slick. He stopped halfway down, turned to me, and for the first time in maybe his entire adult life, he looked at me and really saw me. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," I replied. "We had a deal." He nodded. "I know. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything." "When?" I pressed. "Because your father is probably already covering his tracks. The longer we wait." "Tomorrow," Daniel interrupted. "I'll do it tomorrow. I'll go to the police, I'll give them everything I know, He trailed off, his breath making small clouds in the frozen air. "I'll make it right. Or as right as I can." I studied my son's face, looking for the lie, looking for the manipulation I'd seen so many times before. But all I saw was exhaustion and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of genuine remorse. "Okay," I said. "Tomorrow." He left. I watched him walk away through the snow, shoulders hunched, and I wondered if he'd actually go through with it or if this was just one more performance in a lifetime of performances. I'd know soon enough. I went home to my sterile rented apartment and I opened a bottle of wine. Something cheap from the corner store because I wasn't ready to spend money on celebrations yet, and I sat by the window and I thought about what came next. Because winning Daniel's trial was just the opening move. The real game was still ahead. That night, Richard called me. I don't know how he got my number. Probably from Daniel, probably as some desperate last-ditch attempt to make peace or threats or whatever he thought would work. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. "Patricia." His voice was rough, like he'd been drinking or crying or both. "We need to talk." "No," I said simply. "We don't. Please." There was panic in his voice now, real fear. "I can explain everything. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Janet and I, we just..." "You just what, Richard?" "You just accidentally had an affair with my sister? You just accidentally stole $2 million? You just accidentally tried to have me declared incompetent so you could take everything I'd worked for?" My voice was ice. 40 years of marriage, and this was how it ended. On a phone call with snow falling outside and a stranger's voice coming through the speaker. "I'll give it back," he stammered. "All of it. Every penny. Just don't press charges. Please. We can work this out. We can." "It's too late for that," I said. And then I told him something that made the silence on the other end of the line stretch for a full 10 seconds. "Daniel's testifying tomorrow. He's going to the police with everything. And once he does, the district attorney is going to file charges. Fraud. Forgery. Conspiracy. Maybe attempted murder, depending on how good my lawyer is at arguing that you tried to have me killed by having me declared legally dead." "You bitch." The panic was gone now, replaced by pure venom. "You vindictive, crazy bitch. After everything I gave you." I hung up. Then I blocked his number, finished my wine, and went to bed. I slept better that night than I had in years. Daniel did testify. To his credit, and my surprise, he walked into the police station the next morning and he told them everything. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every lie they'd constructed. He brought documentation. He brought recordings. He brought the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream about, the kind that makes cases impossible to lose. Richard was arrested 2 days later. So was Janet. I wasn't there for either arrest, but Daniel called me afterward and described it in detail. How the police had shown up at Richard's office, how he'd tried to play it cool in front of his coworkers, how his face had crumbled when they'd put the handcuffs on. How Janet had screamed and cried and insisted this was all a misunderstanding, that she'd never meant to hurt me, that Richard had manipulated her too. That last part almost made me laugh. Janet had always been the smart one, the calculating one. Richard was just the man with the checkbook and the ego. But let them blame each other. Let them tear each other apart in interrogation rooms and plea negotiations. I was done caring about their excuses. The legal process took months. Richard's lawyer tried every trick in the book, challenging evidence, claiming entrapment, arguing that I'd orchestrated the whole thing as some sort of elaborate revenge plot. He wasn't entirely wrong about that last part, but revenge being a motive doesn't make the crimes any less real. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic accountant's reports were bulletproof. And when Daniel took the stand and testified against his father with tears running down his face, even the defense attorney looked like he wanted to pack up his briefcase and go home. Richard got 6 years. Janet got 4. Daniel got immunity in exchange for his testimony and cooperation. Some people might think that's unfair, that he got off too easy for his role in the conspiracy. Maybe they're right. But he was my son, and I'd meant what I'd said in that conference room. Despite everything, I was still his mother. That didn't mean I'd forgiven him. It just meant I wasn't going to destroy him the way he'd tried to destroy me. The money was harder to recover than I'd hoped. Richard had hidden it well, spread it across multiple accounts and investments and offshore entities that took another year to untangle. But I got most of it back eventually. Enough to rebuild. Enough to start over. I moved away from the town where I'd died. Too many ghosts there, too many people who'd shown up at my funeral and then never questioned why Richard had started dating again so quickly, why Janet had suddenly been able to afford a condo, why none of the math added up. Maybe they'd known. Maybe they'd just chosen not to see it. Either way, I didn't want to be around them anymore. I settled in a small city 3 states away, a place where nobody knew Patricia and Hutchinson the wife and mother, only Patricia and Hutchinson the attorney. I opened a small practice, criminal defense, family law, the kind of work where I could help people who'd been betrayed and deceived and left for dead by the people they'd trusted most. I was good at it. Turned out dying and coming back gives you a certain perspective on justice. Daniel and I talk sometimes. Not often, but more than I expected. He's trying to build a new life, same as me. He works in construction now, something honest and physical that doesn't require lying or manipulating or pretending to be something he's not. He's in therapy. He's sober. I didn't even know he'd been drinking heavily until he told me he'd stopped. He sends me a card every year on the anniversary of my funeral, which is morbid but somehow appropriate. The card always says the same thing: I'm sorry. I'm trying to be better. I believe him. Most days. Richard writes me from prison occasionally. Long letters full of justifications and apologies and promises that if I'd just visit him, if I'd just let him explain face to face, I'd understand how everything spiraled out of control. I throw those letters away without reading them. I read the first few, back when he'd just been arrested, and they'd made me feel nothing but tired. Now I don't even bother opening the envelopes. Janet doesn't write. Janet doesn't call. Janet doesn't exist in my world anymore, and I think she's smart enough to know that's the only reason I didn't push for a longer sentence. Some betrayals you can't come back from. Your sister sleeping with your husband, helping him steal from you, standing at your fake funeral with crocodile tears in her eyes? That's the kind of betrayal that burns the bridge and salts the earth on both sides. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. The death, the resurrection, the revenge. They ask if I'd do it again, if I could go back. It's a complicated question. I lost 40 years of my life to a man who never loved me the way I'd loved him. I lost a sister I'd grown up with, shared secrets with, trusted completely. I lost time with my son that I'll never get back, years where he could have been someone different if I'd been braver sooner. But I also gained something. I gained myself. The version of me that had been buried under decades of compromise and self-sacrifice and trying to make everyone else happy. The version that walked into that courtroom with a briefcase full of truth and scared the hell out of everyone who'd thought I was gone for good. Was it worth it? Ask me on a good day, and I'll say yes without hesitation. Ask me on a bad day, when the apartment feels too quiet and I wonder what my life would have looked like if I'd married someone honest, if I'd trusted my instincts earlier, if I'd never found those documents and just kept living in ignorant bliss until the inevitable end. Those days, I'm not so sure. But most days, I think about that moment in the courtroom. The moment when every head turned. The moment when my son's face went pale and the prosecutor's voice faltered and Judge Brennan stared at me like she'd seen the dead rise. The moment when I set that briefcase down and reclaimed my name. That moment made it worth it. If you're still with me, thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for following me through death and resurrection and revenge. I hope you never need to do what I did. I hope you're surrounded by people who love you the way you deserve to be loved, who'd never dream of betraying you the way I was betrayed. But if you're not, if you're reading this and recognizing pieces of your own life in my story, if you're wondering how much longer you can ignore the red flags and the inconsistencies and the gut feeling that something's wrong, then let this be your sign. Trust yourself. Protect yourself. Don't wait for them to bury you before you start fighting back. Check the description box below for more stories like this one. Stories about survival and justice and the complicated ways we find our way back to ourselves after people we love try to take us apart. Stories about real people in impossible situations who somehow found the strength to keep going. And remember, sometimes the dead don't stay buried. Sometimes we come back. And when we do, we come back with receipts.